Thank y'all for joining in this kind of strange week as we're coming out of the details of the storm. As I mentioned to those who were on at the very beginning, we still don't have internet at the church, so I'm leading this from home. So if there's a random child noise or animal noise in the background, we'll just keep going. But this is also after last week, which was really our just getting to know each other introductory session. This is the first of our more formal content that we want to cover. And I've been wrestling back and forth with the best way to do this, because on the one hand, I think there's nothing more boring than sitting to listen to an hour-long lecture on Zoom. At the same time, there's a lot of content sort of to cover. And so here's my hope, is that we can sort of do a bit of a compromise. Each of you, I hope, have had a chance, and if you haven't, you can after the fact, to read the chapter of Erskine Clark's book that was emailed out that gave sort of an overview of some European roots of Presbyterianism. And then I really hope, if you haven't, because it was probably more important for our conversations today, had a chance to watch the video, Division and Reunion, that Union Presbyterian Seminary put together. Really, I think, an outstanding video that sort of covers briefly a lot of the major themes of the history of American Presbyterianism. So I'm going to sort of operate under the assumption that you've got that background. And so I'm going to try to blow through at a faster pace than I would if we were together in person, with the caveats being, if at any point you either have a question or need for clarification on something, or a burning issue that you just want to talk about, and now's the time that really connects with that part of the story, go ahead and jump in. It's not an interruption to the class. It is the intention of the class to do that. But then also at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for bigger picture questions as well. I'm aware, however, that the way our first 3 content sessions are set up, it is a lot to sort of pass on. I'm hoping it's not being passed on in such a way as I'm the expert and y'all are the ones who don't know anything about this. That's not what we're trying to do, but we are trying to sort of cover and make sure there's sort of a common core background that we all have as we move forward with the rest of the officer training. So we start with sort of what's the story of Presbyterians, with church history. What do Presbyterians tend to teach? That is, we're looking at Reformed theology next week. And then how do Presbyterians operate? Looking at polity and the Book of Order the following week. And from that foundation, then, that shared foundation, we'll talk about a lot more particular nuances and details and who are we as leaders at Spring Hill Pres in the weeks that follow. So of these 3, history, theology, and polity, though they intersect and overlap so much when you're talking about the larger identity of Presbyterians. And so you can really pick where you want to start. And I find that for me, it's more helpful to start with history, because that provides us with this sort of foundational narrative. And then in the next couple of weeks, we'll jump in and out of that story as we talk about different teachings and theologies and different structures and ways of doing polity. So I'm going to do a screen share, if I can, of, a PowerPoint. Let's see, does it work? Can y'all see that screen there? Then if I do that, okay. All right, the last time I updated the cover page, obviously, was 2015. So this is already history itself, but I'm tweaking this PowerPoint a little bit every year, but apparently I need to tweak that first page. So this is an image that I've really found helpful. Some of you, maybe if you've been through a new member class since I've been here, you've seen this before as well, the Presbyterian 101. I like this image if you can see it, and if not, that's okay. I'll include it in the email. But when we talk about the history of the Christian church overall, often when we do history, we might find ourselves looking at a timeline or a list of dates that can feel very, very linear. I love this image of a tree, a family tree of Christianity, because it's a little bit more organic. There is some linear progression, but you also have this ability to see these branching out of different traditions and different denominations. So I love this idea of the common roots that we all share in Judaism, in the Old Testament tradition. The one trunk that forms the tree that is Jesus Christ, that all of us are connected to. And then these various branches that come off. Large branches like Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, Reformed, and Lutheran. We're right here on the Reformed branch of the tree. And then individual twigs of particular denominations. So the Presbyterians are, I guess maybe, let's see, if that's a branch, then what's Presbyterian, maybe that's a stick. And then off of that, there would be individual twigs there are many kinds of Presbyterians. We're the Presbyterian Church USA, but we know folks that are members of other kinds of Presbyterian churches as well that would be part of this same tree, part of this same branch, and even part of the same stick of Presbyterianism. I think it's good to see. So we're going to talk through these two main groups. When we talk about the Reformed tradition, that's a broad group that's a certain kind of Protestant. So it's not the same as Episcopalians or Lutherans, but it's a broad group that includes Presbyterians as well as some others. In particular, along with Presbyterian, the Congregationalist and some Baptist would fit in this same group as well. Now, we're also then at times going to hone in specifically on the Presbyterian part of this Reformed branch. So at times you may hear me use those two words, Reformed and Presbyterian, interchangeably. I try not to, but the distinction is churches that are considered to be in the Reformed tradition usually are so because of their theology, so what they teach. But then there are distinctions within that broad theological family. There's distinctions around polity, that is how they're organized. So, for instance, for a long while, Congregationalists up in New England and Presbyterians in more of the mid-Atlantic and the southern states, they had very, very similar theology. But their polity, how they organized themselves, was quite different, because Congregationalists were only associated as individual congregations. It was Presbyterians that organized into larger governing bodies that eventually kept folks connected throughout the country. So you'll hear me use those interchangeably, but I don't exactly mean to. Of course, we know folks or have neighbors or family members that find themselves at other locations on this family tree, and it's interesting to see where they are. So the point of this is not to, our focus on today of Presbyterian history is not to say ours is the only story that matters by any means, but rather because of where we are, we need to know where we came from. It doesn't mean that the story of Methodists or the story of Lutherans are not just as important, but that's not the denomination into which you're being trained to be ordained and installed as officers. So we're going to hone in on our particular story. So, of course, the story of Christianity goes way back. It doesn't begin just with the Protestant Reformation, but as we look specifically at Presbyterians, we're going to hone in more particularly on the Protestant Reformation that begins in the 1500s. Some ancient Celtic Christianity is also sort of, because of ties to Scotland and Ireland for Presbyterians in particular, some Celtic imagery and Celtic language also finds its way creeping in sometimes, but that's much, much older. And you'll see these folks, famous Celtic leaders, were alive almost 1,000 years, if not more so, before the Reformation was happening in the 1500s. So just a nod to them. There were some folks like John Wycliffe and John Huss that were sort of predecessors of the Reformation. But really, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, gets kicked off as a religious and social movement in the 1500s with Martin Luther, a biblical scholar, a monk, a trained professor and teacher, who through his study of scripture and disagreements with some of the ways that the medieval Roman Catholic Church was operating, Luther decided to protest against some patterns that he saw to be wrong and beliefs that informed those patterns. It was never Luther's idea to split off and start his own church. Rather, he wanted to change and purify the church from within. But eventually, the medieval hierarchy couldn't handle those calls for reformation. And so they kicked him out. They excommunicated Luther and all the other Protestants. At the same time as Martin Luther, there was a contemporary who was up to some similar ideas over in Switzerland by the name of Ulrich Zwingli. And Zwingli is often credited as the first person to launch the Reformed tradition. So Luther is in Germany starting Protestantism, but out of his teachings, the Lutheran Church sort of follows in one trajectory. Whereas Zwingli's over in Switzerland, and he is interested in some of the same things as Luther, like having worship in the native language that people actually speak, not in Latin that most folks didn't understand anymore. Things like priests being able to marry, to get married to one, well, not to one another then, but to get married. Some other reforms. Now, Luther stayed, while his theology was much different and was sort of a departure from the medieval patterns, his structure, particularly of church government and of the order of worship, was not vastly different. Luther, who was sort of, some people like to say Martin Luther was sort of the last medieval mind compared to Zwingli, but even more so the next one on the list, John Calvin, who was sort of the first modern mind. That's a gross overgeneralization, but Zwingli was interested in getting rid of a lot of things like church seasons, liturgical seasons, not having communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist every single week because of fear of superstition that had grown around it, not having a hierarchical system of priests appointed by bishops, but rather having local folks that led. Zwingli was sort of much more radical than Luther. So then along in Switzerland comes the real famous sort of person who, again, Zwingli's the one who got the ball rolling, but Calvin is the one who's often known as the father of the Reformed tradition. So you can see there, he's about a generation later after Luther and Zwingli. So oftentimes you have a big movement that gains a lot of traction. It's the fiery personalities of the original founders that attract energy and excitement, like Luther and Zwingli. But then if a movement's going to last more than a generation, someone's got to come along and get the thing organized, put some structure to it, give it some legs to stand on independent of the charisma of particular leaders. And John Calvin was sort of the brilliant mind that did that for the Reformed tradition, who really put an analytical mind of a trained lawyer to these questions of theology and church government and approaches to studying scripture. So briefly, John Calvin was French. He grew up in France, was a student at the University of Paris. And as many Catholic kingdoms began to try to squelch the early Protestant church, they would make it illegal to be Protestant in various lands. And so that happened in France. It was there was a pronouncement read in Paris that if you were Protestant, you could be arrested and even killed. So you had, a few days to get out of town before this law outlawing Protestants kicked into gear. And so Calvin, as a student at Paris, left and fled. He had already published some books, and eventually he settled, make a long story short, he settled in Geneva, Switzerland, became the leading pastor and teacher and thinker there. Geneva was already a Protestant community, but he really took them to the next level. One of the things that Calvin did, of course, was his theology, Calvinist theology, or really the first beginnings of Reformed theology. Another thing that Calvin did was a lot of work on church government, this idea that we would not have top-down appointed leaders, but we'd have bottom-up elected leaders, many of whom are called elders. The Greek word for Presbyterian, or the Greek word for elder is presbyteroi, from which we get the word Presbyterian. The other thing, though, that Calvin did was turn Geneva into this sort of international haven for religious refugees. So if you were a Reformed Protestant who tended to agree with Calvin, then Geneva was a place that you could flee to and land when persecutions were happening back home for you. One of those, for us, most important refugees was a guy by the name of John Knox, who was a priest, a Catholic priest, who had begun to read a lot of the writings of Luther and some other Scottish Protestants, and became convinced of the rightness of the Protestant side of things. So he the quickest way to say this, there was a Scottish Protestant leader who was burned at the stake, someone that was one of John Knox's teachers. And in response to that act, the Catholic bishop ordering the execution or the martyrdom of this Protestant leader, there was a violent response to that, and a group of guys broke into the castle in St. Andrews, Scotland, and assassinated the bishop overnight, one night. So John Knox was not a part of that group of assassins that broke in, but after they committed their crime, their next stop was to go to John Knox's house for dinner and an evening time of prayer. So he was very much associated with this group, these folks revolting against Catholic rule. And so he ends up being captured by French Catholics. He and his revolters were forced to serve as galley slaves on French boats, just rowing and rowing. He thought he was going to die on that boat, never thought he'd see his homeland again. But eventually he's able to leave. When Henry VIII dies, his son Edward rules in England for just a little bit, and then Henry's daughter Mary, Bloody Mary as she's often known, became the Queen of England. And so she was a staunch Roman Catholic, and she outlawed Protestantism in England. So it wasn't safe for John Knox to live in England. So he flees, along with all these other refugees from around Europe, flees to Geneva, and he lived there for a while. He came to study under John Calvin, but also to work with him. Knox was in charge of preaching each week to the English-speaking refugees that were there in Geneva. So he was almost like John Calvin's like associate pastor for English, for the English members of our church, sort of. So Knox then, when Mary, the Queen of England, dies, and her sister Elizabeth becomes the new queen, now all of a sudden Elizabeth is Protestant. And so there's this great reversal of, rather than it being illegal to be Protestant in England, now it is legal, and the Catholics are the ones who are going to be persecuted. And so then it was safe to go back home when Elizabeth took the throne. So John Knox left Geneva, goes back home to Scotland, and really becomes the leader, almost like how we think of like George Washington, the role that Washington played in the American Revolution. It was almost like that for John Knox, as the leader and leading voice and the one who was drafting documents and creating things for the Church of Scotland. So Scotland, under Knox's leadership, becomes the first place where throughout the entire kingdom, John Calvin's theology and approach to church government is implemented. Calvin, because of the city-state structure in Switzerland, was really only able to lead his ideas through the city-state of Geneva. But Knox is able to lead it through an entire kingdom. And so now all of a sudden you've got congregations in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and in St. Andrews, scattered all around Scotland. But you also have presbyteries that are formed regionally in each of those, and you even have a general assembly that is nationwide. And so that national connectional church is really what being Presbyterian is about, or a large part of it. So if Calvin is sort of the father of the Reformed tradition, Knox is in many ways the father of Presbyterianism. All right, and it's from there that a lot of we see it, for instance, in our Kirkin of the Tartan service, the sort of Presbyterian fascination with Scotland in particular, not as our only birthplace, but as an important place of heritage, comes through John Knox's leadership. Okay, we already talked about that, right? So Calvin is the one who kicks off, well, Zwingli kicks off, and then Calvin gets organized, the Reformed tradition. And among that group, that large group, it was Knox who gets the Presbyterian church organized for the first time across the kingdom. I like this map, if you can see it, that shows, and I forget the exact year that this is supposed to be, but percentages of religious divisions present throughout Europe. So we're the purple group here. So you see down here in parts of Switzerland, where Calvin would have been, and then across the border into France, and even spreading especially through southern France, you see this influence of Calvinism. You see it up in Scotland, but you also see it in places like the Netherlands, like Holland. You see it over here in places in Eastern Europe as well. That these refugees, what happened is they came from all these different places. They came to Geneva, they worked with Calvin, and then when it was safe to go back home, they scattered back out throughout Europe and took their faith with them, their Reformed faith with them. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those other places as well. So France was that was John Calvin's homeland. He spoke French. Many of his friends were French, and a lot of those refugees who came to Geneva were. And so the group of Protestants, Calvinistic Protestants in France, became known as the Huguenots. That was their name. They were strong, especially in southern France. So the Huguenots, they grew as sort of an underground church because it was illegal to be anything but Catholic for a long time in France. And then Henry, who becomes Henry IV of France, he was a Protestant who was in this long sort of civil war fighting to try to gain control of France as the king, and he ends up agreeing to become Catholic himself in order to secure unifying support for his claim to the throne. But as he becomes Catholic, he, having grown up Protestant, he has the ability to see the importance of these other views as well. And so he signs a document called the Edict of Nantes. And that was a sort of royal proclamation that allowed, while the Catholic Church was still the official church of the kingdom, it allowed some religious diversity to exist. And so the Huguenots all of a sudden don't have to be an underground church anymore after almost 100 years. They can, in 1598, they can come out and become they can organize, they can have worship, public. They don't have to hide what they're doing. And so these French Huguenots thrived, and the church grew and grew and grew and became a really strong center for the Reformed tradition. But about 100 years later, Louis XIV, one of the most sort of power-hungry monarchs in the history of Europe, for Louis, seeing himself as sort of an emperor, the idea of religious diversity he saw as an affront to his lordship as the king of France. That if I'm going to be the one person in charge, how do we have two different churches, right? If I'm Catholic, everybody else has to be as well. And so in 1685, Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes. So you basically had a movement that was able to grow and thrive for 100 years legally, and then all of a sudden the rug's pulled out from underneath them, and you can't be Protestant in France anymore. And so this migration is sort of the first modern displaced refugees begins. And so those French Huguenots, some of them flee to England, some of them flee to the Netherlands, and a good portion of them flee to the United States, coming into places like New York and even Charleston, South Carolina. I've got a ancestor that was part of that French Huguenot flight into that started Charleston. So anyway, so that's part of the mix that makes European Presbyterians. Another, of course, comes, very briefly, James I of England had previously, before Elizabeth died, he was already James VI of Scotland. And so when Queen Elizabeth dies, James becomes, he's the cousin, and he inherits the throne of England, but he was already the ruler of Scotland. And so he, in his person, though the kingdoms were not formally united yet as the United Kingdom, he individually united the rule of the two. And it was James that had the idea first of really colonizing. So we think of like Jamestown in Virginia, right? These early English colonies. American English colonies were really English colonization 2.0. The first place of colonization was just right here across the Irish Sea in what is we call Northern Ireland. And so that was the first attempt at English colonization. So what they did is they sent lowland Scots and northern borderland English. Many of these folks were Presbyterian. They came across the sea over to Scotland, over to Ireland, and they colonized there. And they became the group that is often today called Scots-Irish or Scotch-Irish sometimes, or you'll hear them called Ulster Scots sometimes. So they were Scottish and Northern English who lived in Ireland as sort of a ruling class over plantations that were run by the oppression of native Catholic Irish. All right, so if that makes sense. So Scotch-Irish doesn't mean a little bit of Scottish and a little bit of Irish. It means Scottish by way of Ireland. When we talk a lot about Scotch-Irish folks in the United States, that's where that group comes from. So as a professor, a mentor, well, one of the guys you saw in the video, Erskine Clark, likes to say, they went from Scotland to Ireland, and when they got there, they became more Scottish than they had been in Scotland, right? So their Scottish Presbyterianism that had been an important part of their identity became even more important when they were in this new land. The way I like to think of it is, I grew up here in Alabama, have always been an Alabama fan, but it was when we lived in South Carolina, I think I became a more avid Alabama fan then, because I was away from the homeland. I had to claim that identity in a stronger way. I think in a sense, you had that going on with these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians to an even stronger degree. So a lot of the folks we're going to talk about in a sec who come to America come by way of Scotland, but also Scotland through Ireland along the way. There was a great group of Reformed Christians in England who were leaders of the revolt against the King of England. After King James dies, his son Charles becomes the King of England. And if you know anything about the English Civil War, Charles is the one who is opposed by the English Parliament, and eventually Charles I is beheaded because they didn't like him anymore. And many of the folks that led, right? So if you think of this classic division between as we often caricature it, English folks with a hierarchical, English rule over others, English approach to church government through Episcopalian patterns with a bishop who's over these priests, and that's often, although sometimes a caricature, contrasted with Scottish, emphasis on local rule, you elect your own leaders. No one can tell us what to do. So that Scottish and that Presbyterianism fits great with that sort of Scottish mindset as well. So there were many folks in the Parliament side who opposed this monarchy in England in the Civil War, who were of the Reformed tradition. Some Presbyterian and some Congregationalist or Independents, which meant, well, all right, we won't get lost in the details. Anyway, so during this time, the Civil War, the English Civil War as well, there's the decision that the English church needs, if we're not going to have the king ruling over it, we need a group that's going to make the decisions of what is the Church of England going to be? What structure will we have now that we're getting rid of the king? So they form a group called the Westminster Assembly. It's sort of it's a great example of a committee that's way too big, because it takes them forever to do things. And when they generate a document, it's massively long. But the Westminster Assembly decided that the Church of England would have a certain theological set of beliefs that they would adhere to, and they produced a document called the Westminster Confession of Faith that outlined and explained what those beliefs would be. They decided that the English church would have a Presbyterian form of government, not a priestly appointed Episcopal form of government. They decided on approaches to worship that would not be bound by a prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, but instead would be informed by some guidance, but would be empowered to be independently planned and led by the local ministers. They basically put together what we would today call a pretty Presbyterian approach to church government. Well, when the English War is over, Westminster Assembly finishes, eventually, as the war settles out, the decision is the folks at Westminster, they spend a lot of time on that, but that's not what we're going to do. The Church of England is not going to be a Presbyterian body. It's going to be an Anglican body. That is, it's going to, or an Episcopal body. It's going to have bishops appointed. The king is going to be the head of the church. We're not going to do bottom-up elections. We're going to do top-down appointments. So a lot of their work ended up not lasting very long, except for that confession of faith that they wrote. That Westminster Confession became probably the most important document for the English-speaking Presbyterians all throughout the globe. So the church of, just as the Reformed folks, a lot in particular Puritans, we would call them, adopted the Westminster Confession of Faith in England. The Church of Scotland adopted it. It comes over to America, and the early Americans adopted it as well. So there's this English Puritan branch. So we've got now, we're looking at, right, well, let's see, do I have them here? Yeah, so you can see we've got these groups of Reformed Christians that start making their way to America. You've got English Puritans, some smaller group of which are famously known as the Pilgrims, right, who come to America, English-speaking Reformed Christians. Then you've got the Scottish and the Scotch-Irish. They come to America with a different brand of Christianity. Then you've got the French Huguenots. They're coming to America. In smaller numbers, you have German Reformed Christians as well, or Swiss, some, even Northern Italy. You've got folks coming from all these different places coming to the American colonies. And during the colonial time, these English Puritans, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, and French Huguenots are some of the most significant and influential leaders. They weren't the official church leaders necessarily, because there were in many places established religions or denominations of various colonies. Like South Carolina and Virginia, you had, the Church of England was the official church of the state at the time. But a lot of the early leaders were Reformed Christians. Jonathan Edwards is probably the great American Christian thinker from that era, someone that we can claim as part of our Reformed heritage. This is hard to see this map, but I just want to show you, this shows different ports of entry where folks come into America. You've got some Scottish folks coming into Charleston and Wilmington as well. Some English Puritans here coming into Norfolk. But the big place you want to see, so the major port of entry for Scotch-Irish Presbyterians was Philadelphia. That was sort of the major port of entry. So folks like Benjamin Franklin, for instance, you think of a lot of famous Philadelphians were of that Scotch-Irish ancestry. So Philadelphia is the great place. And then I don't know if you remember this from high school history classes, but as the frontier starts spreading west, there's this trail called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road that becomes the major thoroughfare through which these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians come from Philadelphia, and they spread down southwest. Now, some of them jump over the Appalachian Mountains or the Allegheny Mountains up here, and they go west and found Pittsburgh. But others come down south through the Shenandoah Valley, coming down through Roanoke, and they come down into western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina. And when they get there, you see they start meeting and intersecting with these folks that came from other southern ports. And really, I like to say this Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, it's almost like Interstate 85, right? So you can trace Richmond all the way down through Charlotte, and then into Spartanburg and Greenville. And if you kept taking it all the way down to Atlanta, you've got the strongest parts of Presbyterianism in the South, the places where there's a heavier presence, and really you could extend it all the way down, I'd say, into Birmingham probably, where there's a higher percentages than other places of Presbyterians are, in addition to the great spread of the church, there's also just historical geographic patterns. Where Scotch-Irish immigrated is where Presbyterianism tends to be numerically the strongest, even still today. So the places, Pittsburgh and Charlotte are the two locations in America where the highest percentage of population is Presbyterian. I like to say that's where Presbyterians are the densest, because you can take that a couple different ways. So that's sort of how this thing happens, right? So you got these Scotch-Irish coming down, but then as they start to get further south, then are interacting with English, with French, with Swiss, with Welsh Presbyterians, with German Reformed, with Huguenots as well. So in this early colonial period, you've got this meshing of, right, we all came from our different countries and we brought our different traditions, even of being Presbyterian, but now we've got to find ways to mix them and mesh them. The first Presbyterian preacher in American soil was a guy by the name of Francis Makemie, and he sort of follows that same classic pattern. He grew up in Northern Ireland as a Scots-Irish. He was trained in seminary over in Scotland, and then was sent as a missionary to come to American soil. He spent most of his time, and he was a little bit of Virginia, but also Maryland and New York. He was actually arrested for preaching without a license, right? So you might think, what in the world was that about? Preaching without a license. What that meant was he was a Presbyterian preacher in colonies that were officially Episcopalian or Anglican. The church and state were one, and this guy came in without permission from the ruling Episcopalians to preach a different sounding gospel, or not major, but a different approach to the Christian faith and the Presbyterianism. So he was actually arrested and tried in New York for preaching without a license. And the judge, sort of an early case, even before we were the United States, of sort of how is freedom of religion going to be exercised on these shores, the judge did not, sort of threw the case out, did not find Francis Makemie guilty, but he did make him pay the court fee. So it was his way of sort of saying, we're not going to put you in jail, but don't come back and keep doing this, right? So we don't keep pushing the issue. So Makemie founded churches, especially in Maryland. The other thing that he did, by the time 1706 rolls around, Francis Makemie and a few others have come over at that point, and they formed the very first presbytery. So we'll talk in a couple weeks about Presbyterian polity, but you got local congregations, and the next layer of connectionalism is the regional body that we're in the Presbytery of South Alabama, for instance. They formed the Presbytery of Philadelphia. That was the first presbytery, just a handful of churches, but that was really the beginning of this connectional organized Presbyterianism here. During that colonial period, Presbyterians who've always put a heavy emphasis on education. One of the big things they did was found educational institutions. Princeton, what is now Princeton University, being one of those in the colonial era. You think of this sort of Scotch-Irish frontiersman mentality, right? So what would happen, they'd come out into the wilderness, and as they established a settlement, the three things they would build would be the church, the school, and city hall, right? And that intersection of church, civic engagement, and education became this sort of threefold stool upon which these Scotch-Irish communities were founded and formed. So what is now Princeton was an early version of one of those. Okay, so now let's see, it's 1247, and we're just now getting to the American Revolution. So we're gonna go really fast through this lightning round. The American Revolution, many of the leaders of the revolution were either Reformed Christians themselves, or they had been educated by Reformed Christians. John Witherspoon, in particular, was a significant leader. He had come from Scotland to come be the president of Princeton. At the time, it was called the College of New Jersey, but and it was there that he taught many of the folks who were some of the founding fathers of America. When the Declaration of Independence was officially signed, Witherspoon was the only ordained minister of any denomination to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he was one of us. He was Presbyterian. After the war, at the same time that now we've won independence, but now we got to figure out how are we going to be organized. While the Constitution is being written, you also have this sort of formation of this federal government. You also have this formation of the National Connected Presbyterian Church. So going from 1706 with the first presbytery, a few decades later, there was the first synods beginning to form, a little bit broader regional groups, but the first nationwide connectional body of the Presbyterian Church of America was the first General Assembly that occurred in 1789, and they elected John Witherspoon as the moderator of that first General Assembly. So he's sort of an important transition figure in this development of a national Presbyterian church in the U.S. Just for some context, right? So if that's 1789 that the General Assembly meets for the first time, just to kind of put things in perspective locally, the first church founded in the state, or what is now the state of Alabama, this was a year before statehood, was what's now First Presbyterian Church of Huntsville. That was founded in 1818. Down here on the coast, Government Street Presbyterian Church was founded in 1831. So we're sort of moving into the antebellum period in which you saw, and I'm not going to go into all the details because I think the video does a better job than I would have. So be sure to watch that video, but you'll hear about some of the great Presbyterian debates around race and slavery. And you essentially have the Northern Presbyterian Church and the Southern Presbyterian Church with very different stances around defending slavery and defending abolition, splitting as the American Civil War is starting. The two church, the national church splits in two, and that church, it stays split for 122 years, even after, of course, slavery is no longer an issue being debated, but other divisions creep in. Some famous Presbyterians outside just of that slavery question, although that intersect, some of them do still. John Layton Wilson was a very significant international missionary in the 1800s. As slaves, before the Civil War was fought, there was the Back to Africa movement, where some Southern slaves were freed in order to go back to Africa and start colonies of Western colonies of African Americans back in Africa, Liberia being the primary example of that. So John Layton Wilson was a slave owner who freed his slaves and then went with them to go be a missionary both among them and to indigenous Africans there in Liberia. His fascinating story, there's a whole book written about him that if you're interested in, I'll pass on to you. But then he comes back to America for health reasons. He's been, not really a fan of slavery all along the way. The Civil War breaks out and he sneaks back into the South in order to cast his lot with the South, because even though he's not a proponent of slavery, the South was his home. And so he just this fascinating, conflict, his internal conflict, you could almost say was like the conflict of the nation in a nutshell. But Woodrow Wilson was an early, Woodrow Wilson's father was part of the group that started the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America, that Southern church that split off. So Wilson was a product of that. Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton, so following along these footsteps of folks like Jonathan Edwards and John Witherspoon. And then Wilson, of course, we know other things about him as a president, founding the League of Nations and those sorts of things. But he's sort of a famous Southern Presbyterian. Though it's not covered in the book, it's not covered in the video. While there's this fascinating history of Presbyterianism in America in the 1800s and 1900s, of course, there was continual development of Reformed theology in Europe as well. And one of the leading voices in the 20th century, if not, I would say the strongest theological voice of the 20th century, was this guy named Karl Barth, a Swiss theologian. He had been in Germany as a professor and was run out of Germany because he opposed the rise of the Third Reich and was chased. He had to flee Germany. He ended up settling back in his native Switzerland. And Karl Barth, sort of what Luther and Calvin were for the 1500s, in many ways, you could make the case that Karl Barth was in the 20th century. Famously wrote a book, and a document that's in our Book of Confessions, the Barmen Declaration, which is a statement of complete, that the church, that Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus Christ alone is Lord. And if the church confesses Jesus Christ alone is Lord, then it cannot follow Hitler as Lord or any power that seeks to claim authority over the church. And so part of this movement, at times underground movement against Nazism, and became really a voice of redefining what does it mean to be reformed in the 20th century. Karl Barth was a big part of that. We can talk more about him in a future week. All right, so that was World War II. Again, putting things local context. World War II is also the context in which Spring Hill Presbyterian Church was founded. A couple years ago, we spent a whole year telling our story, so I won't retell things now, but we started in 1943 on Miss Henderson's front porch on McGregor Avenue, moved to our current site in the middle of the 1950s. Lastly, want to cover a few significant, there's some more things to come, but I was checking the time. Some key dates for women's ordination. So if you saw the video, we're gonna talk about just in a sec, this chart that shows all these different Presbyterian denominations that at times have broken off and then have reunited. So when you talk about what key dates for women's ordination, various important dates happened at different times for different denominations, all of which are now part of the PCUSA, but at the time they happened, they were parts of separate bodies. So all three Northern Presbyterian church traditions, you had the United Presbyterians of North America, and then the PCUSA ordaining women as deacons and elders. The first woman ordained as a minister in The Northern Presbyterian Church was 1956. So it started as early as 1906. And then by 1956, we had the first woman as a minister. Now, the Southern Church was late, right? The Southern Church didn't get around until the 1960s, approving ordination for women. But when they did it the right way, and they went ahead and said all offices would be open at the same time. So deacons, elders, and ministers could all be open to women as being ordained. Rachel Hinderlight was the first woman ordained in the Southern Presbyterian Church. And then powerful, I think, to see 1956 was when the Northern Church ordained a woman for the first time. And as soon as 1971, so that's not, in the grand scheme of things, not that long of a period of time between 56 and 71, the first woman was elected as moderator of the General Assembly for the Northern Presbyterian Church. Key significant dates there. Okay, here's that chart. And I'll include in the email, the follow-up email after today, your own version of this on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Although you could print it on larger if you wanted to. But this chart that looks like something maybe an engineer put together. I mean that as a compliment, Courtney. I bet you could follow the logic of this better than some of the others of us, or maybe it looks like something an electrician or plumber would use. But you see these every time you see a split, there's a division that groups going apart, and then when you see these arrows pointing back, you see either groups reuniting or some other kind of unity occurring. So the video that we watched, for instance, that Union did, it talked early on about this division in the 1700s between the old side and the new side. The old side was a little bit more traditional in their theology, and the new side was more open to evangelistic approaches of folks like George Whitefield and the Great Awakening. So this is a whole lot to look at. You don't need to pay too much attention to all of these details, but just a few details. Oh, it's not going to work. No. Okay, there we go. So we get this one big split in 1861 of the Northern and Southern Presbyterian Church splitting because of slavery. And then in 1958, the two main branches of Presbyterians in the North, the UPNA and the PCUSA, these two branches come together in 58 to form the United Presbyterian Church in the USA, or what is sometimes colloquially called the Northern Presbyterian Church. So these two separate denominations form to make a big Northern church, and there was a separate Southern church as well. Why is this not working? In 1973, the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, splits off from the Southern Presbyterian Church. They left because they were upset about women's ordination, about Southern Presbyterians being involved in the civil rights movement, and they were worried about what they saw as the inevitable reunion between North and South. And so they split off to form their own separate, more conservative Southern Presbyterian body, the PCA. And their departure enabled it to happen a little bit quicker, right? They were afraid of something, and by leaving, they caused it to happen sooner than it would have had they still been around. So 1983 was this big reunion that the Northern and Southern Church finally reunited after 122 years of separation that began around the Civil War and slavery. So I brought, just as a quick show and tell, I don't know if you can see this. Well, I'll stop the screen. Let's see if we can do it real quick. I'll stop the screen share and then I'll restart it. So I brought a magazine that from 1983, the Presbyterian Survey. Susan Slickton gave me a copy of this, and I don't know if you can see it, but this is a picture of that big parade that was happening in Atlanta, Georgia, on the occasion of the Northern and Southern churches reuniting. So you had the Southern Church met in one building, their General Assembly, and the Northern Church met in another building for the last time. The only things they did were perfunctory business they had to do. They elected their own moderators each, and then they voted themselves out of existence. And each body then the folks left their buildings and walked down the street as two sort of separate groups, and then turned, and they came to an intersection where both members of both groups mingled together and then marched as one in this great parade into a third location where they would all come in and gather and convene for the very first time as the Presbyterian Church USA, the main body of Presbyterians in America that we're a member of. You can see some footage of that great parade and that reuniting General Assembly on that video. But I brought this, Susan Slickman kept this through all these years and showed it to me, because in this parade, there is this one face that's visible on the cover of the magazine, and that's Vernon Hunter, who was, at the time of reunion, was the pastor of Spring Hill Presbyterian Church. He's our pastor emeritus, and he made the cover of the National Presbyterian Survey because he was a member of, because he was there in that great parade. As Billy McLean was cleaning stuff up and downsizing, he passed on to me. He was there as well. This is the order of worship. So the very first thing they did when they came together to convene this new General Assembly was they had a worship service that included communion. And so I've got from Billy a copy of that bulletin from that very first one. So really cool stuff. Go back to the screen share real quick and wrap up. Oh, that's not that. That's the wrong one. Where was I? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Just a few more things to point out as we close. Oh, come on. There we go. So, so just in short, the pattern you see is you have these two, in 1958, these two large bodies in the North that reunite. And then in 1983, they reunite with the Southern Church. And it's the existence of those three denominations that create the Presbyterian Church USA. So remember that well, I'll give you a hint right now. We'll talk at another time about the image, the logo for the Presbyterian Church USA and all the various symbols and metaphors and images that are woven into it. But one of the basic patterns is that this logo that you'll see on all sorts of things, it's a triple cross, right? So there's three vertical and three horizontal lines making this cross. And that was done on purpose to reflect the three denominations that joined together to make the PCUSA in 1983. The headquarters for the PCUSA is in Louisville, Kentucky. On the address is 100 Witherspoon Street. So they named the street after John Witherspoon, that signer of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, that's a lot of me talking. Y'all did not interrupt, which means I don't have a clue if you were following or if you were snoozing or if you have questions. I do want us to be cognizant of the time, to be respectful for everybody. So if you've got questions, if you're good, all right, I got the story down, feel free to jump off the call. But if you've got some questions or comments you wanna discuss, then by all means unmute yourself and maybe we can stay on for just a little bit and talk about it, any matters you've got. But I want to respect all of your time by not requiring you to stay on. So before anybody jumps off though, before we go into questions, next week we're going to look at Presbyterian theology. So I like to call what we just did the story of Presbyterians, because story sometimes sounds better than history. That might scare some people off. But more so, next week I like to think about, what do Presbyterians teach? Not what do Presbyterians believe. Sometimes when we talk about theology, we can turn that into what do Presbyterians believe. And in reality, there's a diverse pattern of what Presbyterians believe, right? Every single one of you is a Presbyterian, and you don't believe the same thing. So to say what do Presbyterians believe could suggest that there's only this one, laser pointed answer to that. But in reality, though, there are some patterns that you can see throughout the generations that are taught from one generation to the next. So I like to think of it more around, what do Presbyterians teach from one generation to the next? So there'll be a little bit of homework assignment. Again, a paragraph to read. not a paragraph, sorry, a chapter to read from a book. So John Kirkendall, who came to be our guest preacher for our 75th anniversary celebration, he co-authored a book called Presbyterians, Their History and Beliefs. So it's mostly a book of their history. If you're fascinated or if you enjoyed this history today, that's a good next step. It's a very accessible book, but it goes into more details about these various periods. But the last chapter of the book is sort of a good summary of what Presbyterians teach or believe throughout the ages. So that one chapter I'll email out as a PDF to read that summary of Reformed theology. And then we'll talk some next week about the Book of Confessions. So I mentioned that before. If you don't have a Book of Confessions, let me know, and I've got we've ordered them for you. Not for everybody, but for those of you, if it's your first time to be an officer in the Presbyterian Church, I've got that. But I'll also email a link to an online version so everybody can have the most updated version electronically. But if you don't have a hard copy, I want to get anyone who's coming for the first time a hard copy. So I'll send out an email with a reminder, homework, which will be read that chapter and have a copy of the Book of Confessions and kind of familiarize yourself with it. I have a link to that. I'll have a link to this video recording so you can, if you're here, if you need to go back because Buzz talked too long in the lightning round at the end, you can go back and listen. But also, especially for those of you who are joining us after the fact, asynchronously, we welcome y'all now at the end. And I'll also include some of the documents that we talked about today, like that chart of Presbyterian history with all the splits and reunions and that sort of stuff. So, okay. So if you need to go, by all means go. But if you've got questions or things to discuss, we can hang on for a little bit more and do that. Knox is waving, so I think that means he's popping out.
I'm good. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I've got to run as well. Thank you,
We'll see y'all later.
Very informative.
Thank you, Buzz. That was great. A lot.
Well, thank y'all. And as we do theology and polity in future weeks, some of that stuff's going to intersect in. We'll delve more into what exactly was Calvin talking about here, or what exactly did John Knox do when he implemented Presbyterian patterns? What does that mean? What does that look like? So I hope this history will be this sort of grounding background for the theology and polity in the next couple of weeks. Also, if you've got questions, you can call or ask or email me after the class as well. So, all right, thanks everybody. We'll see you next Tuesday at noon.